Happy Wednesday night, everyone. I am so glad that you're here again with me this week. No doubt even to talk about Leviticus in a minute. What a week to tune in. Now, I'm aware that there are other things that you could be watching live tonight, some national event or something like that. I can tell you this, you'll feel better after our time together, and your blood pressure will probably stay a little bit lower. So I'm glad that you're here watching this live. Not at all advocating being uninformed, but just saying, listen, sometimes we pick and choose what we want to fill our time with, and I'm glad you're here with me tonight to talk about being a more responsible Bible reader. So thanks to all of you who are tuned in. I'm grateful that you're here. We're going to talk about Leviticus tonight. I mean, what better way to spend an hour of your life than talking about the book of Leviticus, everyone's favorite book of the Bible, no doubt. So just a reminder of what we talked about last week. We talked about the book of Genesis, and we were really trying to ask the question, what is Genesis trying to do? What's it trying to do? And we decided, at least I kind of postulated for all of us, and you may or may not agree, that Genesis is really not trying to answer the how and when questions, especially the ones that we would want to ask of it in our time. But really, Genesis is trying to ask and answer the who and the why questions. And so we looked at some other ancient Near Eastern creation stories, and we saw that Genesis is telling us that the God of the Bible, Israel's God, is different than the gods depicted in those stories. And the reasons that the God of the Bible created humanity different. We saw that in other ancient Near Eastern creation stories that humans were created because the gods didn't want to work and wanted somebody to do all the grunt work they didn't want to do out on earth. And that's how those groups conceived of their own beginnings. And the Bible talks about a God who is filled with love and compassion for his creation, who wants a relationship and creates for different reasons. And so we just said, hey, if we ask the right questions of Genesis, maybe we don't have to have a lot of the battles that we end up having when it comes to how to read Scripture. If we're not trying to make Genesis do what it's not trying to do. Tonight, we're going to stay in the first 5 books of the Bible. We're going to stay in the law. Now, Genesis is technically part of the books of law, too, but it's a little bit different. We are going to talk about what you might think of when you think of the law and all the obscure rules and regulations. You get Leviticus. I'd love to know your Leviticus story. Like, if you tried to read it and stopped, or if there was something that really made you scratch your head, like, if you have had an encounter with Leviticus that's interesting or funny or frustrating, I'd love for you to just briefly write that in the comments and let me know your history with Leviticus. What I have found, and I think I mentioned this last week, what I have found is that for many people, Leviticus is the place where their yearly best intentions to read through the Bible stops. Okay? Their best intentions stop there in Leviticus, if they're trying to just start in Genesis and move through. And so they read Genesis, and that's interesting. There's a lot of stories there, stories they're kind of familiar with. They get to Exodus, and especially the first part of the book, pretty great. Yeah, we can make it through the regulations about the tabernacle and some of that stuff. But Exodus has enough, story and narrative in it to keep us interested. But then we get to Leviticus. And when we get to Leviticus, we are immediately presented with a whole bunch of rules that seem sometimes strange, sometimes obscure, sometimes disgusting, sometimes a little off-putting. And so we just sort of stop. And so when people say, hey, I want to read through the Bible in the year, do you have any plans? I often will recommend other plans that don't include just starting at Genesis and reading all the way through. There are other ways to do it. I just don't want people getting to late February or March and stopping because they hit Leviticus. Now, I happen to think Leviticus is interesting, but I also happen to be strange when it comes to what I find interesting. So I don't blame anyone for not loving the book of Leviticus. I'm not confident tonight that you're going to love it as much as I do by the time we're through with our time together, but I think you might hopefully at least have a better understanding of what Leviticus is trying to do and what we do with this strange book. So I asked you last week and before class to read Leviticus 19:19, come to class dressed scripturally. Now, when I taught this in person a few years ago, this this question worked a little better in the room. Everybody's looking at the tags on their shirts, and we're having funny conversations. So I can't see any of you. I'm wearing what I think is cotton, so I think I'm good. Let's see how are we dressed tonight. Leviticus 19:19. Keep my decrees. Don't mate different kinds of animals. Don't plant your field with two different kinds of seed, and do not wear clothing woven of two different kinds of material. Listen, y'all, these polyester shirts, these 50-50 blends, not going to cut it. Not going to work. What are you doing? Are you violating Scripture with the clothes that you're wearing? Or does Leviticus have some commands that maybe we aren't going to follow? And if it does, well, then does it also have some commands that we are to follow? And if it does there, then how are we supposed to know the difference between, except for just saying, well, that sounds weird, I'm not going to do it, and that makes sense, and so I am going to do it. Hey, what do we do with that? Now, I'm not going to give you just a rigid framework by the end of the night to say, well, as you're reading Leviticus, here's a solid, tried and true criteria to say this stuff you're supposed to follow and this stuff you're not. That's not the goal, but we are going to try to give some framework to what we're reading when we read Leviticus. So, Leviticus, as I said, is part of the books of law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. In Hebrew scripture, it's called the Torah. The Greek word, and what you'll hear some people call it, is the Pentateuch, 5 books. Okay, the books of law. So when you read the Old Testament and it talks about someone reading the book of law, it's some portion of Genesis through Deuteronomy. Now, not all of them together, but those first 5 books are considered the law for the nation of Israel as they're on their founding journey. So we're talking about, they're not just the books of law, that's the kind of genre we're talking about. It's law, okay, out of these broad categories of Scripture. Now, we are going to talk about the genre of law, like what kinds of writings you're going to encounter. And so how do you read books of law, especially thousands of years later? But tonight, what's even more important for us to read Leviticus well is to keep in mind context. Remember, we've talked every week. There are 2 big tools that if we can learn a little bit about those things, we'll be able to read Scripture more responsibly. The first is genre, so understanding what kind of writing this is and what rules it plays by and how we're supposed to read and apply it. The second one is context. The 2 areas where people get hung up a lot. Context. Especially tonight, we're looking at the context within the rest of Scripture. What's going on that leads to Leviticus? A lot of people think Leviticus are just these obscure rules that God arbitrarily hands out. But there's actually a reason for what you find in Leviticus. And we'll find that reason when we go back to the book of Exodus. So you may know the story as we get into the heart of Exodus where Moses goes up on the mountain and the people are impatient. And so they recruit Moses' brother Aaron, and they make the golden calf because they can't wait around. And Aaron goes, I don't know what happened. Moses calls him on it, and Aaron says, I don't know what happened. We just threw this gold in the fire, and out popped this calf. Creative excuse there. But God's angry with the people because they've broken covenant. He's just gotten through making a covenant with them. They've broken it. And so God says, I've seen these people, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation. So God's angry, and he says, Moses, leave me alone. I'm just going to kill them. And Moses and God have a discussion. And whether you want to say Moses talks God out of it or not, or whether you want to characterize it another way, at the end of their discussion, God has a plan not to kill them all. But they have become impure and unfaithful. So the question is, how is this holy and pure God going to be among a people who are unholy and impure? Leviticus is the answer. Leviticus is the answer to how we solve the problem of Exodus. So the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. And he said, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when anyone among you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. That's how Leviticus starts out. So there's some stuff between what we just read in Exodus and what we're seeing in Leviticus. But essentially, Leviticus is how are God and God's people going to get along now that they have broken covenant? And there's going to be some ways to keep themselves pure and holy and clean. And Leviticus is that answer. Now, it does seem strange, no doubt. I mean, Leviticus is not how we're going to maybe be holy and clean. But basically, Leviticus is, oddly, a writing of grace. Because this is God who says, okay, I won't kill everyone. And so I'm going to make a different plan. They deserve to die. They've broken covenant, but I'm not going to kill them all. And here's how they're going to have to live. So Leviticus, oddly, is a manifestation of God's grace towards his creation. That's my little soapbox on Leviticus, just because I don't think it's going to ever be folks' favorite thing to read, but instead of viewing it as some weird thing that is strange and strict and arbitrary, it does help to view it as an act of grace. This is how God is going to continue to dwell among his people and not kill them after what they've done. Okay? That's what Leviticus is doing. So let's talk about some big issues in the book of Leviticus. We're going to talk about a couple of different kinds of issues. Number one is the kinds of laws you're going to find. There are two main ways that laws work, and then we're going to talk about some different categories. And you may, when we get to that section, you may find yourself in some more familiar territory when we talk about like ethical and ritual laws and things like that. And some of you who may have been Bible readers for a while are going to be familiar with the ways that we've categorized these laws in Leviticus. But first, let's talk about two different kinds of laws. Now, the big words here are apodictic and casuistic. But you might think of them as unconditional and conditional laws. So here's what I mean by that. Here's an example of an apodictic law from Leviticus 19. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Don't go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't deceive one another. Don't swear falsely by my name. Don't defraud or rob your neighbor. Don't hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Okay? Don't curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind. These are absolutes. Do this, don't do this. So these are apodictic laws, which are unconditional. These are things you must do all the time or you should never do. Apodictic. The second kind are casuistic. These are the if-then kind of laws. So if something were to occur, here's how you respond. If anyone becomes aware that they're guilty, if they unwittingly touch anything ceremonially unclean, whether carcasses of animals or unclean creatures, and they are unaware that they've become unclean, but then they come to realize their guilt, or if they touch human uncleanness, even though they're unaware of it, but then they learn of it and realize their guilt, or if anyone thoughtlessly takes an oath to do anything, whether good or evil, even though they're unaware of it, but then they learn of it and realize their guilt. When anyone becomes aware that they're guilty in any of these matters, they must confess in what way they have sinned. And as a penalty for the sin they have committed, they must bring to the Lord a female lamb or goat from the flock as a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for them for their sin. Casuistic. So I don't know if you noticed the language in that law, but it's a lot of if this. If they do this and they're unaware of it, but then if they become aware of it, then they do this. So I don't know that changes a whole lot about how we read Leviticus, but I think it helps us read it better when we understand there's two big kinds of laws. This is the absolute, do this all the time, never do this. And then there's the more conditional, if this happens, here's how to respond. Okay? I think those two categories help. Hey, remember, drop questions in the comments or anything you want to say. Anything funny you want to comment on this? I'd love to hear it. Let's banter a little bit about Leviticus. I mean, how often do you get to do that, right? Banter about Leviticus. Probably not something you do every day. So any questions you have, anything you read that sparks interest, I'd love for you to chime in and join the discussion this week. I know Leviticus is not the greatest discussion starter in the world, but we can have a good conversation if you want. So let me know if something is interesting to you. Let's talk about some other categories. And these are the ones, if you have had classes on Leviticus, these are the categories that you might be a little more familiar with. Now, let's do a caveat here. There is no part of Leviticus that says, here are the 3 categories of laws contained here, and this one category is only for these people now, and these other 2 categories are perpetual, and everyone from here on out should follow them. It doesn't say that there. See, again, if you remember our first week, we talked about people who, with good intentions, will say things like, I don't interpret the Bible, I just read it. But then they'll very quickly talk about why they should follow some laws in Leviticus and why others were just for that time. And then they begin to have a difficult time articulating why. Like they'll say, well, these are ethical laws for all time. And they're not wrong about that. What they're doing is interpreting, though, because there's no place in Leviticus that says, this section is for all time, and this section is just for these folks. So if you're reading this in the 2000s AD, this is what you have to follow, and this is what you don't. That aside, it's not then to say, well, we're hopeless. We don't know what to do. There's no guide. It's to say, good people through the years who've done a lot of work and research have tried to categorize these things. And if we can categorize them, then we can begin to make efforts at figuring out, are any of these for us, or are none of these for us? And how would we tell the difference if it's half and half? Okay, let's get to the categories. Civil laws. These are penalties for crimes. So this is how this society set up its justice system. And this is where you get some eye for an eye stuff. This is where you get specific penalties if you cause injury or you cause death. If you violate someone's personal rights, their property rights. You're going to see a lot of this in Leviticus. Some of them are quite strange. Some of the behaviors are oddly specific that it's going to mention. But this is how they set up their justice system for the time. So there's civil laws. Then there's ritual laws. This is how to worship. So what kind of space should you be in, and how do you set it up, and what are the rules for priests, and what are the rules for sacrifices? All right. So these again begin to be kind of oddly time specific, and so you might look at these and say, well, that was specific to Israel because it's how they set up their worship space, and they used priests and sacrifices, and we know that most of that has been, I don't know if we want to say done away with. You have to be careful with the language here. But there's been some changes to that structure in the person of Jesus and the church, Christians would want to say. So anyway, so there's civil laws, there's ritual laws, and finally, there's ethical laws. This has to do with how to love your neighbor. And we're going to see some specific examples of that in a minute. Okay, here's where this begins to help us be more informed Bible readers. What most people will say, and they're basing this off of years of study and research and trying not to be arbitrary. I know it's convenient to say, well, they just made up rules so they don't have to do certain things and they get to pick and choose. And certainly we want to be careful about that. And we're all prone to that. But what most people will say is that the first two, the civil laws, how that particular society had its justice system set up, and ritual laws, how that society was set up to worship. They'll say that those two categories are pretty time-bound and are not necessarily intended for all people at all time, okay? But when you get into ethical laws, it's a little grayer because it's going to talk about how to love your neighbor, and there may be some specific ways we do that differently. So I understand that this isn't like again, it's not laid out there. And if you want to accuse people, or not accuse, if you are concerned that we're not super consistent with it so that we're picking and choosing, you're not wrong for having that concern. Like, it's fair to wonder about that. And that's why I'm just really careful about using Leviticus in specific ways because it's really easy to let our own biases creep in. We'll see that in a minute. But most scholars will say, okay, we're going to do ethical laws for sure, and the ritual and civil laws, not so much. Okay? So Josh asks, is there a reason for different kinds of animal offerings? Specifically, why use a lamb for this or a goat for that or a bull for this other thing? I probably don't know enough to answer that completely. It does seem to me when I read the stuff on sacrifices that it sort of escalates, and different kinds of offerings, which are different levels of severity, end up escalating the kind of animal. But so broadly speaking, they do tend to escalate in size and maybe importance in society. But as to why it's a bull and not some other large animal, I don't know enough to answer that really well. Nick says, I'm glad Jesus pointed out that love and treating people with love fulfills the law, because I can have a hard time remembering all the details in Leviticus, like boiling goat meat in milk. Yeah, I'm very grateful that I don't have to remember some of these details in Leviticus. You're exactly right, Nick. Thank you. Again, drop questions in the comments. I'm happy to read them. Let's talk about a few specific examples. I want to show you what happens when we start quoting Leviticus, some civil laws and ritual laws, and we try to make them eternal, because it becomes really difficult. So here's a few specific examples. And these examples are just as a cautionary tale to realize how easy it is how easy it is to pick and choose. So, don't cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. Now, I have heard sermons and talks at camp and youth group stuff about tattoos, and they'll quote this verse. Okay? And you shouldn't have tattoos because the Bible is against it. Now, I'm not here to tell you whether or not you should get a tattoo. I'm just here to tell you that Leviticus is not the place you want to go if you want to prohibit tattoos. Why? Well, because if I go a verse earlier, if somebody is telling me that who is clean shaven and has gotten haircuts, then they're very inconsistent. Because just a verse earlier is, don't cut the hair at the sides of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. Okay, so what that means is you can't go quote Leviticus 19:28 to tell people the Bible prohibits tattoos and forget the verse right before it that talks about the kind of hair trimming that you're allowed and not allowed to do. That is terribly inconsistent. There's no good way to say, well, for some reason when we get to 28, that's for all time, but 27, well, that was just because, those Israelites were supposed to grow out their beards, okay? Tattoos are a different discussion. But Leviticus, if you're going to use Leviticus to say you can never get a tattoo, then you better watch what you're doing with your razor, okay? See how easy it is to pick one out? How about another one? Get a little bit deeper here. Okay, Leviticus 18:22. Don't have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. Now, I'm aware that Leviticus is not the only place in the Bible that discusses sexuality, sexual orientation, sexual activity. I'm just saying that Leviticus is not the place you want to go to make your case for any of that. It's just not. Because again, here I'm told that pigs are unclean. So you can't eat their meat or touch their carcasses. They're unclean for you. Okay, so I cannot use Leviticus to talk about sexuality and then go eat bacon. It's inconsistent. You've got some different ritual laws going on there, and you're going to pick one out and ignore the other. Again, I'm not here trying to make a broader point about the Bible's teaching about sexuality. I'm just saying Leviticus is not the place you want to go to make your case. Leviticus can be one place you go to begin studying the whole context of Scripture. I'm just saying, like, don't be quoting Leviticus at people to make your case about sexuality. It's not going to work. They're immediately going to go and point out some other things. I am a fan of the TV show The West Wing, and there's an episode, I think pretty close toward the beginning of the series, where the president comes in to a meeting, and there is a radio host there, and he does this kind of thing to this radio host and says, hey, you know, we've been outside playing football and we've been touching the pigskin. Do we have to all be killed, or can we save the chief of staff? I'm really butchering the dialogue there, but in a very, I would say, pretty snide way, he points out how easy it is to just poke holes in consistency in that. So I'm just saying, like, okay, let's don't use Leviticus for specific rules on like tattoos and sexuality. If you want to talk about that, there are other places in Scripture to go and have a good discussion about it. Leviticus is just not, it's going to be so hard to be consistent with applying Leviticus once we get down to that level. So if that's not how we want to read Leviticus, how might we read it more responsibly? A couple of things. First, respect the context, and that is it's part of the covenant. Okay? This is God's response to covenant breaking, and it's how he's going to keep covenant with his people and how they're going to keep covenant with him. It is how they're going to stay in a relationship with God in their circumstances. So again, the context, like we said earlier, it is a response to the events in Exodus. Respecting the context. The second thing is knowing what has been renewed. Now, some of you might have come to our class tonight expecting a pretty robust discussion on like what gets renewed explicitly, and that's fair. Like that's a great discussion to have about what Jesus explicitly renews in the New Testament, and that's some people's criteria, by the way, for reading Leviticus, and that makes some sense to me. It's if Jesus brings it over again and talks about it, then it seems to be that he's carrying it over to different eras. Fair point. We're not going to spend too much time on that tonight, but a couple of examples. When Jesus gets asked what the greatest command is, he says, love the Lord with all your heart and your soul and your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And you think, wow, Jesus is preaching love. Like that's such a cool New Testament thing. Well, it is a New Testament thing, but it's also an Old Testament thing. Look what he's bringing over. Here's this from Deuteronomy 6:5. Now, this is not from Leviticus. Like we said, we're focused mainly on Leviticus, but there are other parts of the Old Testament that are considered law. So, in Deuteronomy 6:5, love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your strength. And Leviticus 19:18, don't seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. Hey, love your neighbor is not a New Testament thing. That's not fair to the Old Testament. The Old Testament, Leviticus, for goodness sakes, is the place where we first read to love your neighbor as yourself. So that's an example of something that gets brought over from the law. Love the Lord your God with everything you got, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus is quoting the old law, as we might say, and basically making the case that it's permanent. Those things are for all time. So there's an example. I know that's an easy example. Like nobody's going to argue that, you know, we shouldn't love God or love our neighbor because that was just a time-bound thing for that culture. But that's the biggest and most obvious example that you can see. Like some of this stuff really does get quoted. Here's the last one. And I say this with several of our categories of books because I think it's important. If you get bogged down in the details or you're not sure exactly what to apply, man, look for the heart of God, because God has not changed. Now, some of these rules may have changed, but God hasn't changed. And the things he's passionate about, the things he gets angry about, the things he's excited about, those things are the same. So the way that he has his people deal with those things might look different, but those things are the same. So I'm going to take us back to Leviticus chapter 19, and I want us to read some of this together. I want you to pay attention to all the different groups of people that God is concerned about. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't deceive one another. Don't swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Skip down to 32. Stand up in the presence of the aged. Show respect for the elderly and revere your God. I am the Lord. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. We're almost done. Do not use dishonest standards when measuring length, weight, or quantity. Use honest scales and honest weights, an honest ephah and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Keep all my decrees and all my laws and follow them. I am the Lord. So a lot of specifics there, but you probably noticed some big principles that we can apply from that. Some groups of people that we pay attention to, some different ways we conduct ourselves. So when I read that, these are the groups of people I sort of see pointed out here. Neighbors, hired workers, the disabled, poor and rich, and favoritism that often accompanies those things. And then don't hate in your heart and respect the elderly. There's a bit about treatment of foreigners and some things about dishonest economic practices. Well, those seem to be universal. I can pretty easily go to the New Testament and find some things that reinforce that. But do you notice the kinds of people that God is concerned about here? It's vulnerable people. It's vulnerable people who are at risk in society, okay? The hired workers who rely on hourly wages and often are mistreated, people who are disabled, people who are poor and how they're treated by the rich, the elderly, foreigners. All those groups of people are at risk in any society because they're not part of the dominant groups. And God is saying, look out for those particular groups of people. Yes, all of you are important, but we're going to focus on these groups because they need special attention because they're at risk. That's a great application for us, right? And our practices, I mean, I might not be using literal scales and ephahs and hins, but am I setting up my finances, my billing practices to be honest? That's a great principle to take forward. Okay, let's just look at a few of what people are saying today. What they're saying tonight. Back to something earlier, the question about the different kinds of animals. Ron, perhaps the difference is economic. Yeah, very well could be. Economics do play more of a role than sometimes we think. And at Memorial Road, Phil reminded us in a recent sermon about these kinds of things, and about I think Jeff Simmons even, especially in a lesson that we aired on a Wednesday night, talked about why Jesus is so upset about defrauding people in the temple, because they're taking advantage of the vulnerable economically. So that's absolutely a possibility. Mark says it's good stuff. We sometimes we hear a very clear message about what we need to do or who we need to be. Yes, and you can go to Leviticus and actually see some clear messages amidst some of these maybe stranger laws. Mary Ann says, your lesson has reminded me how God cannot be a part of sin and the great lengths he went to have a relationship with his people then and now because of Jesus with us. Thank you, Mary Ann, for your comment. That's a great summary. Yes, God can't be a part of sin, but instead of distancing from us, he often provides ways for us to be holy. We would call it God made him who had no sin, and we become his righteousness. Okay, that righteousness comes on us. I'm not saying it very well because I wasn't prepared to make that mode switch, and that's my fault. But God provides ways for us to be in relationship with him when we don't deserve it, when we have no way of doing it. Leviticus actually can remind us of that, strangely enough. If you have questions as you move forward, feel free to type those in the comments. I try to look back over these a couple of times a week, and if anyone has said something, I'll try to respond either publicly or privately, and you can always contact me as well. I want to point out one resource to you, not necessarily that you're going to be wanting to go read this, but there is an author. Her name is Mary Douglas, and she did an incredible study about Leviticus where she tried to make sense of these laws. And I'll just summarize what she's saying. She says it's not really about health restrictions, and she has a great point. Sometimes we say, God is keeping them from getting sick because they can't eat pork, and pork can lead to some diseases, and maybe. But then pork becomes clean in the 1st century AD, and their cooking practices and health practices hadn't improved all that much. So if clean and unclean is just based on safe and unsafe, I think we end up with some problems, because it's not as though when Peter has his vision and all the foods become clean, it's randomly the cooking practices have caught up and they don't get sick from eating uncooked pork anymore, for instance. So that reasoning, we try to make some real practical reasoning for it, well-intentioned. I'm not sure it holds up across the board. And she talks about things being in their proper place, because as we know, the people of Israel, it was a lot about the social boundaries that marked you off, and it was mainly circumcision and keeping the dietary laws and keeping the certain feast and festival days, those works of the law. And so there were social boundaries. And so she looks, for instance, at sea creatures who have feet. Those are often unclean because they don't belong. Sea creatures are supposed to swim. They're not supposed to have feet. And so they're not in their proper sphere. And so basically, she says Leviticus and its rules were reminders to the Israelites to stay in their proper sphere, stay in their lane, and not go outside of that. So everything you can eat and can't eat is a reminder to you of your boundaries. Now, you don't have to buy that right now, but that does make some sense to me about that this is more theological and ethical rather than just practical and for health reasons. Her study changed the trajectory of Leviticus studies from then on. And any course you might take on Leviticus as an undergraduate at a university, for instance, is going to talk about her findings. So I will commend that resource to you. Next week, we're going to talk about the books of history, particularly Joshua and Judges, but even more than that, just the books of history in the Old Testament, Joshua to Kings, there's some Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, but really we're focused on those first few books, and we're saying, are these books just recounting the facts? Are they trying to be unbiased, neutral retellings of history? Are they doing something else? And what do we do with some of these violent texts? And how do we read those responsibly? Okay? When we're done tonight, love it if you would like and share this again. I'm so grateful for those of you who get the word out. Make sure and visit the website if you want to see the schedule of what's coming up. And I am, again, grateful for your time with me tonight. I'm grateful that you spent it talking about Leviticus. I think there's been a few more comments since I mentioned that earlier. I'll go look at those and respond as I can. Really, really grateful for you tuning in each week, for the ways that you are engaging and being encouraging. I'm thankful for that. And hey, hope you have a great night. We will see you next week.